We're going to talk now to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen, who chaired a meeting with his state counterparts as well on Friday. To take us there, here was the Queensland Energy Minister, Mick de Brenni, after that meeting, hailing their decision to change the electricity market's rules. A new objective will be introduced to lower emissions.
This will make sure that our market bodies look beyond just electrons and dollars when they're taking actions and making decisions on behalf of our national energy market. It'll make sure that our market bodies take into account the future of this planet when making decisions about our national energy market, and that's incredibly important. It sends a clear signal, a direct signal, for more investment in clean, renewable energy and storage here in this nation.
Chris Bowen, welcome to the program.
Thanks, David. Good morning.
I want to start on this new emissions objective that was agreed on Friday. It's the first change in the national energy objectives in 15 years, and you and your state counterparts certainly, we're talking this up as a pretty big deal. I'm not sure there's a great understanding, though, of what it actually changes, what it means. Can you explain to us, because some energy companies aren't happy you've done this, what will it actually mean in practice?
It is a very important step forward, David. The national energy objectives really decide how our three market bodies, the regulator, the operator and the commission, work, and they have to comply with the objectives and all the work they do. Now, of course, electricity generation is Australia's largest source of emissions, 33%, and our laws, our objective, haven't given our three bodies the capacity to consider emissions reduction. It's just been bizarre and ridiculous, and we've fixed it. The federal government and the states and territories working together, we've fixed it, and it will make a material difference to how these three very good bodies do their work, because they can only comply with the objective in all the decisions they make. And that has led to some really silly and perverse outcomes in the past, and we've stepped forward to fix it. It really builds on the progress of the government passing our climate bill through the House, 89 to 55, showing that we're getting on with the job and making the rules really more sensible.
So again, just getting to what it means in practice, if an energy company wants a new gas peaker plant commissioned, how will this emissions objective apply to that? Will it mean that the regulator will have to say no?
Well, let me give you a real-life example, David. A little while ago, Transgrid wanted and suggested that to help Broken Hill, they'd put in a microgrid of renewable energy. It was much more reliable, much lower emissions, and they were told at that point, no, you've got to keep your old diesel generators running, because and it wasn't the regulator's fault, it was what the objective said. And, of course, climate and emissions reduction will sit aside the other objectives, reliability and price and safety, but finally they will accept the reality of climate and provide that certainty to the regulators. Okay, so it is a big difference.
But what happens if it's a gas plant, if Transgrid or AGL or Origin was saying, we want to build a new gas plant here in the Hunter or whatever? What does this new emissions objective mean?
Well, I mean, of course, there's a whole bunch of decision makers around that, not just the regulators. Of course, there's state and federal governments, etc. And you know that's quite a different perspective. But in relation to the regulator's job, they're making decisions every day. The Commission's looking at the rules every day.
Now, I'm just trying to establish what this new thing you've agreed on means. Does it change anything when it comes to, a company wanting to build a new gas plant?
Well, it certainly changes things in relation to transmission. It certainly makes it easier to get new transmission up. Certainly makes it easier for energy companies to make sensible decisions about transition to renewables. It provides certainty to investors, which is what we're all about. We're sending the message to the world that we're open for investment in renewables, in transmission and storage. It's a big change, unanimously agreed between myself, the states and territories. The previous federal government had vetoed it. It's been ridiculous. We've gotten rid of that block and we're getting on with the job.
OK, but it doesn't stop fossil fuels? I just want to be clear on this. Does it change anything in relation to fossil fuels?
Well, what it does, it sits alongside reliability, price and security as the objectives of our market regulators. Now, the market regulators aren't really the decision makers about new gas plants, for example. They're decisions for governments, as has been the case. Right. But the regulators do. The operator runs the system every day. The regulators, if you like, manage the behaviour of all the generators, and that's a very important job.
So on
and
that,
they haven't been legally able to take into account emissions reduction, and it's been ridiculous, and we've fixed it.
So running the system each day, they're often purchasing, minute by minute or 5 minute by 5 minute, the cheapest power that might be available that time of day or night. Now they have an emissions objective to consider as well. So does that mean they might go for the lower emission power option rather than the cheapest?
Oh, look, I don't think it'll change the way the Australian Energy Market Operator runs its day-to-day 5-minute operations.
So what does it change?
Well, as I said, David, I mean, I gave you a real-life example a moment ago of Transgrid and Broken Hill. It will change the way the Australian Energy Market Commission has been thinking about, and I'm sure we'll talk about the capacity mechanism. It just gives them another opportunity to really be sensible in the way they make the decisions and makes it legally possible for them to consider emissions reduction in the decisions they make, whether they be daily decisions or monthly decisions. It puts it in the heart of their decision making. It should have happened a long, long time ago. It's finally happened now under a new government.
Let's talk about that capacity mechanism you mentioned. So a couple of months ago, people might remember the Energy Security Board proposed this model for a capacity mechanism to ensure reliable supply was always there. The proposal that they put forward could have included coal and gas. I know you and your counterparts discussed this on Friday. Did you officially kill off that proposal?
No, what we did, David, let's just step it through. We agreed that we need a mechanism. The transition has been too slow and too disorderly under the previous government. We've had 4 gigawatts of power supply come off and only 1 gigawatt come on, which is in a very real sense has caused the crisis we've been through in recent months. So we all agree we need, if you like, a safety net to help us with that transition, to ensure that we have capacity and firming of new renewables. And we're all agreed, all of us, that we need to encourage new renewables, new transmission, new storage, and we need to firm it as we go, and it's really important. So we looked at the work of the Energy Security Board. We've taken that and we've said we'll continue to work on it as ministers, and we'll consider it at our next meetings in October and December and work towards a final decision. But we all agree we need our mechanism, and we need a mechanism to help us with the inevitable closure of coal-fired power stations. We need a mechanism to help us get the new investment on to ensure the transition is more orderly, because it hasn't been orderly and it hasn't been fast enough. And we're going to take the system to 82% renewables, and this mechanism that we ministers, state and federal and territory, will hold the pen on, will help us manage that transition, because we all want that transition to happen more quickly, but we all want to ensure the reliability. And that's been lacking because we've had 4 gigawatts come off and 1 gigawatt come on, and that doesn't add up, and hence we've been in a crisis over recent months.
But will it include any payments to coal-fired power to prolong the life of coal generators?
Well, look, there's various ways we could work this through. We can have a one-size-fits-all model, or we can have various mechanisms to help us with the various sectors. The ministers have been talking about that, but we haven't made any final decisions. Again, it'll be a consensus, unanimous approach, if you like, which is what we got in our 6-hour meeting on Friday. A very, very constructive approach taken in the room by all the jurisdictions, because we're all trying to do the same thing, which is manage a very complicated transition, but manage it more quickly. We're all trying to get more renewables into the system, and we are determined to keep reliability as we do so. I
want to turn to your plans for the safeguards mechanism, and apologies to anyone struggling to keep up with all the different mechanisms that you're working on here. So this is one of the main tools you want to use to achieve the emissions reduction that you're legislating, 43% and then net zero. It'll apply to the 215 biggest emitters in the nation. What penalties will they face if they don't gradually lower their emissions as you lay out?
Well, again, David, this is very important, because you don't reduce emissions as a country unless you reduce them from your biggest emitters, the 215 emitters. 28% of our emissions as a country are covered by facilities within the safeguards mechanism. So this was a very important policy we took to the election, and we sought a mandate to implement it, and that's what we'll get on and do. Now, in relation to some of the finer implementation detail, the trajectory is very clear. We're putting these emitters on a pathway to net zero by 2050, as you would expect. That's the nation's objective. Now, there's, again, some detail to be worked through. I'll be issuing a discussion paper in the next week on some of the finer details about how we help emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries, for example, those facilities, based on the principle of comparative impact to ensure the emissions don't just get taken overseas. It's a very sensible approach. In the same methodical way, the new government's setting about all our big reform agenda. We're bringing people with us, consulting carefully. I was in the Hunter this week talking to coal mines who will be dealt with, and talking about how it's going to work, and had very constructive and positive discussions. I'm looking forward to feedback from industry, from climate groups, from other MPs and senators about the detailed design. We're getting on with it, but we are doing so in a way that's consultative and taking some, varying views around the sector, as you would expect, about how it could best be achieved.
As you mentioned, the trade-exposed sectors. So an aluminium smelter, for example, will there be anything here that puts them at a comparative disadvantage?
Well, look, aluminium smelters are obviously big emitters. I was again this week at Tomago. They were talking to me about their plans to transition to renewables. I mean, they want to make the transition to renewables, and they are in the process of doing that, and they're doing great work.
But if they don't, or if they can't?
As is the Portland smelter, also committed, and they're very excited about our offshore wind, both of them, Tomago and Portland, very excited about our offshore wind initiatives that I announced last week, because they will link directly to offshore wind farms. Now, what we will do is there'll be a range of mechanisms available to facilities like aluminium smelters to either reduce their emissions directly, which they're working on doing, or offset. And the integrity of our offset market is really important.
So they'll have to buy offsets?
Well, of course, offsets is an option available to them. They will be able to work through how quickly, and again, the safeguards design will take into account that, say, an aluminium smelter might have options at a different time frame than, say, a gas facility or a coal mine, or indeed Qantas and Virgin, who are also covered. They've all got different technologies available to them. They can use offsets in various ways. We are ensuring the offset market has integrity. Hence, we've appointed Professor Ian Chubb to conduct that review. It's very, very important, because net zero does involve offsets, and that ability will be available to safeguards facilities.
Another important question of principle for this, the design of this safeguards mechanism, what happens to new gas projects like the Beetaloo Basin? Will they have to offset all of their emissions from day one? Because otherwise, that's going to increase Australia's net emissions.
Well, in relation to Beetaloo, the particular example you used, both the Northern Territory and the Commonwealth Government have accepted the recommendations of the Pepper Review, the Pepper inquiry conducted by the Honourable Justice Rachel Pepper, who said this should only happen if there's no net increase in greenhouse gas emissions, so they'll all have to be offset.
But there is debate about who should fund the offsetting.
There's a long way to go on the Beetaloo. There's a lot of investment decisions that companies are yet to make, but the principles that are carried in the Pepper Review will be implemented. In relation to other new facilities, any facility which emits more than 100,000 tonnes of carbon a year, whether it's a new facility or an existing facility which is just increasing its activity, we're not changing that architecture. They'll be covered by the safeguards mechanism, and they will be put on a trajectory to net zero, facility by facility, in a flexible way, which is why we've designed it this way, in a very sensible way. We want to work with those facilities.
Yeah, but will they have, sorry to interrupt you, but will they have to fully offset their emissions from day one? Because otherwise every other 215 big emitters will have to do even more. So
No, David. I mean, this is done facility by facility, and as you'll see in the discussion paper that I released, it's a very comprehensive paper which runs through options in a very consultative way. But new facilities, as I said, whether it's a brand new facility or what's more likely is an existing facility which is increasing production, because there are some places where they're sort of in or out, right on the edge of the safeguards mechanism. They'll be given a trajectory down to net zero. It'll be developed in full consultation, looking at the emissions reduction technology available to them at any particular time. That will vary. Looking at their competitive tensions and looking at what constraints are on other people. And I want to make this point, David. This is actually important too for Australian industry, because increasingly around the world, the most competitive industries will be those decarbonising. Increasingly, Australia and other countries will be exposed to carbon tariffs. This will help us avoid those by showing the EU and the rest of the world, no, we're getting on with it. We've got this safeguards reform. You don't need to slap tariffs on our manufacturers and our producers, because Australia now has a government that gets it, and we're working with industry to get emissions down in a very sensible way. And that's exactly what our safeguards reforms, which have been backed by the Business Council, the Australian Industry Group, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, will achieve.
Can I just ask you one more on this? It's a key question about the safeguards mechanism. Will it stop new coal and gas projects?
It's not designed to do that. It's designed to ensure that it's designed that all facilities, whether they be old or new, are reducing their emissions. Now, of course, we've had the discussion about new coal and gas, and Tanya Plibersek's taking her role very seriously as Environment Minister on her approval. She's showing that, acting very diligently and professionally, as you would expect of a minister's calibre like Tanya, and that's what we'll continue to do. But the safeguards mechanism is not about that. The safeguards mechanism is taking our 215 biggest emitters and working with them to reduce emissions, because if we don't, we're just going to continue you the sort of 10 years of no reduction in emissions from those facilities, and it's not going to cut the mustard.
Look, as part of this huge energy transition we're all on, there is going to be increasing demand, a huge increase in demand for the minerals that are required for solar panels, wind turbines, batteries and so on. The International Energy Agency's spelt this out. It says not only will the demand soar, prices are likely to shoot up as well. What are you doing now to ensure that Australia has adequate supply, secure supply at a decent price for these critical minerals?
Well, that's 100% right, David. In everything you've just said, we are right at the forefront of the world supply of these minerals, whether it's lithium or the other things. We need to ensure we're adding value, and energy supply chains are a real issue. This is what I've talked about with my Quad Energy Ministers colleagues in the first ever Energy Ministers meeting of the Quad, which I hosted in Sydney a couple of weeks ago. Frankly, it was mainly about those supply chain issues. For example, around 85% of solar panels in the world are currently made in China. Over the next few years, that will rise to 97%. Now, that provides real challenges and real opportunities for a country like Australia, because we should be making more solar panels in Australia. We put 60 million solar panels on our roofs in the last 10 years. 1% of them have been made in Australia. We can do a lot better than that.
The minerals, though, when we talk about a gas reservation mechanism in Australia, do we need to have a mechanism to reserve some of these things like lithium in Australia for our use?
I want to, and the government and Ed Husic and Madeleine King and the cabinet want to be adding more value to those minerals in Australia. We want to be actually taking the lithium and turning them into batteries in Australia. That's why we have a battery manufacturing precinct policy that Ed Husic has written. That's what we'll implement. That's really important. You're right, David, about the question. Yes, we need to be concerned about this, and yes, we are, and we're getting on with it.
Finally, I mentioned earlier the result of what's been happening around Taiwan. China has suspended climate change talks with the United States. Now, clearly, these two big emitters, we need cooperation between them if we're going to have progress on what is a global challenge. How worried are you about this?
Look, internationally, David, it's been a case of good news and bad news over the recent days, I think. Good news overnight from the United States to pass their climate bill through the House of Representatives. That's a big step forward. I'm very welcome, and congratulations to the Biden administration and the Congress for getting on with it. Bad news, I agree with you, that those talks have been suspended. In all the tensions between China and the United States, the one thing that's been ring-fenced up until now has been climate discussions. They've agreed they've got a lot to do to get together. We want the world's two biggest emitters talking with each other. I do hope those talks are resumed and that suspension is lifted, because that is a blow, and it would be better if those talks resumed.
Chris Bowen, thanks so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure, David.